So this is the third effort. I got, I unzipped the vest, going a little more casual. I have up right now this report I found. It's Compensation Advisory Partners newsletter, April 24th, 2013. April 24th, 2013 is 5 years before the murder of Rogelio Santander, who is a police officer in Dallas, who was a Dallas police officer. At the time this occurred, it was announced that it was not only him, but he had a female partner who was also shot and killed. Sometime later, when I got to Dallas, I went and looked at the memorial, and her name isn't on the police memorial, even though Rogelio Santander's is. I had at some point after that talked with both a DART police officer as well as a member of the Houston Police Department, and they told me that at some point that she'd actually gone to the hospital and that she'd recovered. She did not die. And so the initial reports were inaccurate. But the thing is that for at least 2 days after the shooting occurred, there were public notices that listed both her and him as having been shot at a Home Depot in Dallas. Now, 20 days before that, I was attempting to address a legal matter, and I got a ticket. I got a ticket for the train for not having fare to buy a ticket. And exactly 20 days after that ticket was issued, Rogelio Santander was murdered. I say that because this Compensation Advisory Partners newsletter, that's dated 5 years before his death, is entitled Influence of Federal Reserve on Compensation Design and Financial Services, an analysis of compensation disclosures of 23 large banking organizations. It's apparently co authored. There's two authors, and then there's two research assistants. I haven't read through it, but the thing that is very compelling to me to consider is the fact that at some point after it was determined that my history in Chicago was to be erased, that the traces not only of me, but of very important historical matters connected to me were to be erased, and then there was to be a rewriting of history. One of the major correlations had to do with Poland. It had to do with the fact that I had written an article on the 35th anniversary of Martin Luther King's travels to the city of Chicago to protest, among other things, something we don't talk about much these days, but apparently has very important matters concerning restrictive covenants. This concept of where you're allowed to live and who's allowed to live where. That there are explicit or sometimes implicit preclusions on certain people living in certain places based on something somebody else has determined. It's not quite the same as redlining when it comes to political redistricting. And so when we talk about Martin Luther King's journey to Chicago, we're not talking about public housing. You understand? The reason that public housing came up is because the understanding was it had to be understood what it meant. Public housing was supposed to be a temporary measure on a way towards something else. Now, my former work experience in Chicago along those lines has been rewritten in a manner that is inaccurate. If there were aspersions cast on me because there may have been things in my articles that were not verifiably third dimensionally accurate or factually correct at the time, I already know what they would be. And I would have already been open to a conversation. What I'm not open to is a complete disappearance of a very important time frame in history so it can be recharacterized for opportunistic political purposes. And what I've learned is that there are people who have a certain kind of sentience and consciousness that allows them to be able to pick up on currents associated with underwriting, on securities that are working in connection with their identity. And the securities are issued by whom? Would they be banking organizations? Now, at the time Rogelio Santander was murdered, There had been a notice that had been published a short time before, less than 6 months before, that had discussed how a bank from Spain was seeking to get greater access to the market in the United States connected to the Community Reinvestment Act. In order to do that, there are certain standards that need to be met. And it was a very interesting period of time because with the onset of certain digital and online banking possibilities, branch banking in its traditional form took a different meaning, right? And so did the metric 23. As a matter of fact, shortly after Rogelio Santander was murdered, there was an announcement that the nation of Poland was making changes to its pension system specific to its judges and justices. And among the things it mentioned was how 23 justices that were between a certain age and that I understood had become judges or justices under the former Soviet Union were retired early. Now, apparently, sometime after that, they were called back up. In another dimension, somebody has coded the metric 23 to be the specific metric associated with trafficking of people, specifically from Central and Latin America. How many times have I reported bond fraud connected to that specific matter? How many times? How many are there? 850, 1.2 billion, plus 230 million, 400 million, 450 million, but in between that, 850 million. And then that first 850 million was broken between 7 and 1. See, these sorts of parsing out, these sorts of things, this kind of leveraging, also correlated with all of these other little things that happened, right? These little things like that cop dying and those 23 judges and justices of the Polish judiciary being retired early, but then being allowed to get back active. I don't know why I'm saying this. It's not like anybody pays attention, right? How many states just recently approved the legalization of marijuana? Is medicinal marijuana going to be made available for billing to Medicare? Are they going to allow people to bill Medicare for medicinal marijuana? See, anything else I could have done, whether it was stopping a cop from being murdered or maybe addressing fraud involving the Supreme Court pension system or the judiciary of another country, was subordinate to making sure people could get marijuana legally and as cheaply as possible. And there would be no better way to get it than if you were already on Medicare and it had been legalized and it had been allowed to be made available for billing as a prescription in conjunction with your Medicare coverage. We're not going to talk about the prosthesis, and we're not going to talk about the mobility assistance devices, and we're not going to talk about the joint replacements, and we're not going to talk about the other kinds of prescriptions that have to do with actual items that accompany people getting their bones strategically broken or having some sort of degeneration of their bone or other tissue based upon being hyperexposed to electromagnetic frequency that is intentionally encoded with subconscious or unconscious implants in order to impact them biophysiologically because somebody needs their specific demographic to be registered as part of somebody else's concept of an acceptable banking modality. But all of this is for naught because, unfortunately, Congress didn't do its job. 3 years in a row, Congress has failed to meet the basic constitutional standards when it comes to its own responsibility to address the appropriations process. We are coming up on a time frame where an emergency appropriations bill was approved last year. The only things it financed were the Department of Homeland Security and Medicare. I contend that what they were doing was setting up an electronic drug regime that was based on extorting people into acts of prostitution in order to impact their hormone levels with a bombardment of pornography, telemedication, low-level radioactivity. Now, some would say it's medicine because it's helping who do what. How much weight have I gained? How many mornings do I wake up with my kidneys in agony? You need me to go to the doctor. Somebody needs to get paid with my pain and misery. The thing is it was fraudulent to begin with. You were using alleged health care to smuggle drugs and weapons and try to compel me to engage in acts of prostitution. And that's why you won't let me go to court. That's why you won't let me participate in any of these congressional hearings that allegedly have some sort of merit. That's why you won't let me have my own bank account. That's why you won't let me get a job. How many other people, women, men, young people, not quite retirees that have agreed to buy into this specific kind of end-of-life saga? See, the actual people who are supposed to actually be on Medicare, what are they getting? You weren't allowed to get on Social Security at 10 years old when the people that are supposed to be drawing Social Security now were 10 years old.